The architecture of loneliness.
From Exile to Hyperconnection, How the Human Net Was Torn, by Elias Winter, June 8th, 2025. Read by an automated voice.
There is a wound beneath the noise of the age. It is not new. It is not accidental. It was built. For centuries, we have disassembled the nets that once held human life: kinship, ritual, presence, tribe. In their place, we have raised towers of capital, of spectacle, of digital artifice. The body endures, but the habitat is gone.
We name the wound loneliness, but the word is too small for what we face. This is not a mood. It is not a private failure. It is a condition, structural, civilizational, mass-produced, and now it deepens. Never have so many been so connected in image and so severed in substance. The machine that promised presence profits from absence. The systems that mediate our days feed on the ache they create. We scroll, we swipe, we ache.
And yet, this was not our nature. It was not our inheritance. We are creatures of the net, of the fire, of the circle of voices. The body remembers what the age denies. This is the story of how we came to be here, of how exile became ordinary, of how the human condition was captured by the machine, and of why this wound must be named before it is made permanent. Chapter 1. The sentence was exile. There was a time when the word alone meant death, not metaphorical death, not a mood or an ache or a poet's phrase, but the stark end of the body, its warmth undone by the cold, its pulse silenced by hunger, its flesh made prey beneath indifferent stars. To be alone was to be sentenced, and the sentence was exile. We were not born for solitude, we were born for tribe. The ancient human did not walk the world as an individual. He did not wake to a silent room, did not eat in the glow of a screen, did not perform his life for strangers he would never touch. He was woven, tightly, bodily, into a living net of others, kin, rivals, lovers, elders, children, ancestors. The band was the body, the self was a node, and to be cut from it was to bleed in a way no clotting could repair. The architecture of our flesh remembers this. The pulse quickens in isolation. Cortisol floods the bloodstream. Sleep fractures. Vigilance rises to a panicked edge. The body does not believe it is safe without the hum of others near, because for most of our history, it was not. The modern world calls this loneliness. It prescribes therapy. It writes think pieces about the epidemic of disconnection. But what we call a crisis of mental health is, at root, a crisis of habitat. The human animal was shaped not for the apartment or the office or the algorithmic feed. It was shaped for the circle, for the fire, for the murmur of voices, for the touch of familiar skin in the night. In the deep time of our species, the band was constant presence. You woke to others, you worked with others, you ate, sang, made love, fought, grieved, all within the dense weave of communal life. Privacy, in the modern sense, was inconceivable. Solitude was not freedom. It was a precursor to death. And when true loneliness came, when exile was declared, it was not an inner state. It was terror. The body itself understood the verdict. Picture her. A woman of 28, accused of witchcraft after a failed hunt, her status already precarious. The band gathers. The decision is made. She is banished. No fire, little food. The tundra opens before her. Now each night, each sound, each shifting wind becomes a threat. Her body floods with panic, not metaphorically but chemically. Her mind sharpens not for thought, but for survival. Sleep fractures. The heart races. She is not feeling lonely. She is dying alone. Should she survive, should another band take her in against the odds, the scar of social death will remain. The exile never fully returns, the body remembers. Even lesser wounds of loneliness, bereavement, the loss of kin, were born in the arms of the tribe. A father losing a child would be surrounded in grief, rocked in ritual, held in weeping. But even so, grief could isolate the heart, create an inward cleaving. This was the ancient echo of the loneliness we now normalize. The fantasy of the self-sufficient individual, the rugged loner, the sovereign man, was unknown to that world. To be strong was to belong. To be alone was to perish. And today, we warehouse the old in private rooms. We raise children in isolated homes. We measure connection in follower counts. And then we marvel that the body sickens. What we call a loneliness epidemic is no epidemic. It is habitat collapse. We are not meant to carry the silence of modern life alone. And if we would repair the wound, we must begin by naming it, not as pathology, but as the absence of the net that once held us. Because to be alone was once a sentence, and for too many, it still is.
Chapter 2: The Age of Hierarchies, when loneliness became a condition. There was a turning, a slow one at first. It did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept. First the land was broken, then the people. Around 10,000 years ago, we crossed a threshold we could not uncross. We began to seed the earth in rows. We learned to pen the animals we once stalked. And with these acts, planting, taming, enclosing, we planted something else as well: hierarchy. For millennia, human life had been a net of mutual dependence. The band was the unit. Kinship was the currency. The body's safety was woven into the presence of others. To be cut off was death. To be surrounded was life. But the agricultural revolution shattered the net and built, in its place, a tower. At first it was small, villages of mud and stone, but the tower grew. Villages became cities. Cities became states. States became empires. And with each ascent, the human bond thinned. No longer was presence assured. No longer was belonging given. One could now live among many and be unseen. One could sit in a palace and starve for touch. The wound of loneliness, unnamed in the old world, began to appear. It was not yet a concept. It was a condition. The birth of distance. The tower had levels. That was its genius. That was its cruelty. At its base were the peasants, the ones who still touched the earth. Their lives remained dense with others. The village was still a net, if a coarser one. Families pressed close in shared dwellings. Work was collective. Worship was communal. Privacy was rare. Solitude, when sought, was an act of will. But higher in the tower, the air grew thin. The rulers, the priests, the wealthy retreated into structures of stone and protocol. Proximity was now political. The body of a king was no longer a man, but a symbol. To touch it was taboo. To approach it required ritual. The human bond dissolved beneath the weight of status, and so began the loneliness of power. The Chinese emperor, cloistered within the forbidden city, surrounded by a sea of functionaries, none of whom he could trust. The Roman patrician, ensconced in marble halls, while the city swirled below in markets and slums. The Persian satrap, exiled by rank from the touch of the common world. Hierarchy had birthed a new solitude, one made not of physical distance, but of social distance. One could now be alone while surrounded. One could be seen, yet never touched. Alone in the crowd. The city brought another kind of wound. For the first time, humans could walk among strangers. To be alone in a crowd was now possible and common. In Uruk, in Thebes, in Rome, the streets were full, but the ties were thin. The ancient apartment blocks of Rome, insulae, housed hundreds. But kinship was absent. Migration, conquest, and commerce had broken the old bonds. One could live cheek by jowl with others, yet know no names. One could hawk wares in the market and vanish when night fell. Letters from the period speak of this ache. The young lover, unseen in the throng. The freed slave, cut loose from former kin but unaccepted by citizenry. The immigrant, nostalgic for a home to which he could not return. Here, for the first time, the modern loneliness of the city flickers into view. Exile, loneliness as weapon. But the purest loneliness of this age was imposed. Exile had become a tool. The Greeks institutionalized it, ostracism. The Romans wielded it against political enemies. The Chinese emperors banished dissenters to the provinces. To be exiled was not merely to lose status. It was to be cut from the net of speech, of ritual, of human touch. Ovid, the poet of Rome, knew this. Banished by Augustus to the windswept outpost of Tomis, he wrote not of injustice, but of ache. His Tristia mourns not merely the loss of Rome, but the loss of voice. There were no Latin speakers in his place of exile. He could not speak his mother tongue. He could not hear the rhythms of his culture. He was alive, but unheld. Here the modern ghost of loneliness is clearest, not imposed by physical threat, but by the absence of those who make us human. The peasant and the sacred net. Yet for most the net remained. The peasant of medieval Europe did not suffer the modern condition. His life was overfull with others. The house was crowded. Work was collective. The church was communal. There was little room for solitude, and still less for chronic loneliness. In this world, to seek solitude was an act of the sacred, the solitary and the divine. Some did seek it. The religious solitary withdrew not to be lonely, but to be alone with God. The Christian hermit, the Buddhist monk, the Sufi ascetic. These figures chose the desert, the forest, the cave, not as punishment, but as pilgrimage. Consider St. Anthony, alone in the Egyptian desert, beset by temptations, yet held by a greater presence. His solitude was not abandonment. It was union. In this, the ancient fear was transmuted. Solitude became a path. Loneliness remained the shadow, feared, unnamed, to be avoided. When loneliness became shame. But when solitude was not chosen, when it was imposed, it remained a mark of failure. The widow without kin became an outcast. The leper was walled away, a body made unclean, a soul made untouchable. The heretic was excommunicated, cut not only from the church, but from the very net of the sacred. In this age, to be alone was to be judged. The inner ache of loneliness had no public language. It was not a confession. It was a stigma. The tower had been built. And so the age of hierarchy left us with this legacy. A world where one could be alone in the crowd. A world where power bred distance. A world where exile was the purest wound. A world where the sacred could redeem solitude, but only for the few. And a world where loneliness, when it emerged, remained a shameful thing, unspoken. The modern loneliness we name today had begun to take shape. Not yet theorized, not yet claimed, but present. The tower had been built. Its shadows had begun to fall.
Chapter 3. The Invention of the Inner Ache. There was a time when the soul had no room of its own, when it was not a room at all, but a thread, knotted into the tribe, the earth, the divine. No one spoke of an inner life, because life was not inner. It was sung, woven, shared. The gods lived in the river, the stars, the soil, not inside the self, but in time, slowly, inexorably, a new architecture of being emerged. The old net frayed. The soul began to fold inward. And with that folding, a new ache was born. It is here, in this long stretch from Athens to Baghdad, from the Desert Fathers to medieval London, that we begin to glimpse a loneliness, not of the body, but of the self. The restless heart. The Greeks were among the first to turn the gaze inward. Socrates, standing barefoot in the marketplace, spoke of the examined life. Plato wrote of a soul that longed for the divine, trapped in a world of shadows. This was a rupture. The human being as a seeker, not merely a member of the polis. But it was Augustine who carried this gaze to its trembling depth. In his Confessions, the Bishop of Hippo wrote not merely of doctrine, but of ache. Our hearts are restless, he confessed, until they rest in thee. Here was loneliness not of the body, but of the soul, its yearning unsatisfied even amid the ritual life of the church. It was an audacious thing, to right the self, to unveil an interior world where longing, guilt, and grace contended in secret. With this, a threshold was crossed. Loneliness had become possible within, even amid the throng. The solitary cell. Yet the inward turn was also sought deliberately. The Desert Fathers fled the cities of late Rome. Hermits withdrew to caves and sands, seeking not abandonment, but a purer union with God. Monastic orders arose, Benedictines in communal cloisters, anchorites walled into solitary cells. Here, solitude was sanctified, but it was also perilous. Monks wrote of acedia, a desolation of the spirit, a creeping despair. The battle was not against hunger or thirst, but against the slow corrosion of the soul in silence. In medieval England, anchoresses were bricked into stone cells, one window for communion, another for food. Julian of Norwich found visions in her cell. Others found madness. This was chosen solitude, but when the ache came unbidden, it had no name but sin or trial. Outcast and unseen. For the masses, life remained dense. The medieval village was crowded with kin, guild, festival, and faith. The market, the church, the pilgrimage offered constant weaving of presents, but some were cut from the net. The leper's bell rang before the outcast, a warning. Unclean, untouchable. Lepers were walled outside the city, denied the sacraments. Their isolation was total, bodily, spiritual, communal. To be excommunicated was a deeper terror still. One was not merely shunned by men, but by God. Salvation was severed. This was a loneliness beyond even death. And widows without kin drifted at the margins, seen yet unheld, their presence a reminder of the net's fragility. The poets of longing. Elsewhere, in the courts and gardens of the Islamic world, another voice rose. The Sufis, Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Al-Ghazali, sang of longing. But theirs was not merely a lament. Loneliness became in their hands a path. Don't run from loneliness, wrote Rumi. It is where the beloved will speak. Here, the ache was aestheticized. To hunger for the divine was no shame, but a mark of depth. One could be alone in the crowd, and yet in communion beyond it. It was a poetry of absence, but also of hope. The word not yet spoken. And yet, through all these centuries, There was no word for what we would call loneliness. Latin had solitudo, neutral or holy solitude. Greek had monos, single, alone. Arabic washa evoked eeriness, not a state of self. Old English spoke of onlyness, mere aloneness. The modern ache, the chronic psychological disconnection, remained unnamed. It flickered in the cell, in the exile, in the leper's heart, in the restless confession of Augustine. But it had not yet become a recognized state of the human. It was still exceptional, still framed as punishment, sin, or holy trial. The cosmology of the age, the church, the ummah, the dharma, still held the self in a shared frame. But cracks had opened. The crowd was growing stranger. The self was growing deeper. The ache was beginning to speak. The modern wound had not yet been born, but it was gestating.
Chapter 4. The Age When Loneliness Found Its Name. There are hinge points in the story of a species, quiet turns, unnoticed at first, which in time alter the shape of the soul. Between the years we now call 1500 and 1800, such a turn occurred. The tribe had long ago given way to the city. The god of the village had been displaced by the god of Christendom. The emperor had towered in isolation. The monk had battled the demons of solitude. But the human self, as an interior sovereign thing, had not yet been fully born. Now, in the crucible of Renaissance, Reformation, and reason, the modern individual took form, and with that birth came another. The condition we call loneliness. The unfastening. What drove this slow unfastening of the human net? The Renaissance sang of individual genius, of the dignity of man. The Reformation shattered the mediating church, leaving the soul alone before its maker. The scientific revolution disenchanted the cosmos, replacing divine presence with the indifferent mechanics of law. And the city swelled, with migrants, markets, strangers, dissolving the inherited bonds of kin and guild. The world became more mobile, the self became more psychologized, and the ancient buffers against disconnection grew thin. By the 17th century, the English language itself testified to this change. A new word appeared: loneliness. Not merely onliness, the fact of being alone, but a felt ache, an inner absence. The culture had given it name. The soul had given it voice. Alone before God. Nowhere was the new interior ache more visible than in the Reformation. The Protestant conscience was a naked thing. Gone were the saints to intercede. Gone were the monasteries to enfold. The Mass had been stripped to its austere core. Faith was now personal. The soul stood alone before the inscrutable will of God. Martin Luther's early crisis was not merely theological. It was existential terror. Alone in his monastery, he feared damnation no human hand could prevent. No priest, no sacrament could bridge the chasm. Only faith. But faith must be wrestled from within. Here, for the first time in mass religious life, isolation was a spiritual fact, not an accident. The thinking self. The Renaissance also birthed a new kind of solitary gaze. Montaigne, in his essays, turned inward, not to instruct, but to confess. He wrote of fear, vanity, contradiction. The human self was now a subject to be examined. And in Shakespeare, the modern interior alienation found its tragic voice. Hamlet's soliloquy, "How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable," spoke not of exile or sin, but of a heart estranged in its own mind. This was no longer the loneliness of the leper or the widow. It was the loneliness of the thinking self. Cities of strangers. The swelling cities of the early modern world, London, Amsterdam, Paris, became the crucibles of this new ache. Migrants uprooted from village and kin poured in, kinship frayed, The poor crowded into lodging houses, surrounded yet unknown. Samuel Pepys, walking London's fog-choked streets, recorded the new mood. Melancholy among the crowd, a drift of spirit untethered in the press of bodies. This was modern loneliness in embryo, to be unseen amid multitudes. Letters from the void. Yet even as disconnection spread, new forms of tether emerged. The letter became lifeline and torment both. The postal system carried words across growing distances, but in doing so, revealed the abyss between sender and beloved. Wives of soldiers preserved letters like relics. Their words ache with absence, not the terror of death, but the slow erosion of unseen days. The novel arose as mirror to this condition. Clarissa, a young woman betrayed and isolated, revealed, through the intimacy of the epistolary form, the anatomy of a soul in lonely siege. Empire and estrangement. Beyond the cities, the engines of empire scattered souls across the earth. Explorers, missionaries, and agents of the crown found themselves amid alien cultures, neither belonging nor able to return. Jesuit letters from China or New France speak of homesickness not as childish longing, but as a spiritual wound. Even as they served vast imperial networks, they were cut off, bodily, linguistically, existentially. Nostalgia itself was born in this age, as a diagnosed malady of longing for home. Privileged solitude, forced loneliness. And so a final split emerged. For the elite, solitude became a badge. The villa, the study, the private garden. To withdraw was to cultivate selfhood. But for the poor, the migrant, the widow, the outcast, loneliness was not chosen. It was inflicted. It was the byproduct of forces beyond their control. That dialectic remains with us still. The new ache. By 1800, the architecture of the modern ache had been built. The self was interior, reflexive. The crowd was anonymous. Faith was solitary. Mobility was disruptive. Empire was estranging. Language now bore the word loneliness. The condition we now call epidemic had been seeded. Its full flowering was still to come.
Chapter 5. The century when loneliness became a mass condition. Some centuries changed the scaffolding of the soul. The 19th was such a century. In these years, the modern architecture of disconnection was built. In the factories, in the slums, in the literature of longing, in the silent rooms of women, in the forced wanderings of the migrant poor. What had once been an ache of exile, or a solitude sought by mystics, became a mass condition. No longer the fate of the few, but the air breathed by the many. This was the century when loneliness became democratic. The shattering of the net. The changes came fast, faster than the body or the spirit could absorb. The factory replaced the field. The machine replaced the hand. The city devoured the village. The sacred calendars were fractured by the secular clock. Faith gave way to capital. Kinship gave way to contract. The migrant left the soil of his ancestors for a wage in a city that did not know his name. The very rhythms of life were uprooted. And the self, already psychologized in earlier centuries, was now exposed, unbuffered, in the iron machinery of modernity. Loneliness was no longer an exception. It was becoming normal. The cult of solitude. The privileged retreated into an aesthetic of isolation. The Romantics glorified the solitary genius, the misunderstood artist, the wanderer above the world. Wordsworth wandered, lonely as a cloud. Byron's Byronic hero brooded in defiant estrangement. Goethe's Werther made suicidal longing fashionable. Young men across Europe donned blue coats and yellow vests to mimic his doomed ache. Here, solitude was framed as depth, as authenticity. But it was a privilege. For the poor, loneliness was not a pose. It was imposed. The machinery of alienation. For the working masses, the factory was a crucible of estrangement. The Industrial Revolution tore apart village life. Peasants became proletariat. Artisan became labourer. Work was de-skilled, life desynchronized. Engels wrote of the English working class packed into slums, living side by side yet strangers. The old bonds of kin and craft were gone. The new urban existence was one of proximity without connection, a crowd without communion. Marx named this condition alienation. The worker was estranged not only from the product of his labour, but from his fellow man, from his own human essence. Loneliness had become systemic, structured into the very mode of production. The city crowd. Sociologists like Durkheim and Simmel chronicled the new pathologies of the metropolis: anomie, normlessness, spread. The individual in the city developed a blasé attitude, a psychic shield against the onslaught of stimuli. But the price was a deadening of connection. In the crowd, one was unseen. Among thousands, one was alone. The literature of loss. The novel became the mirror of this new condition. Dickens gave us the orphan, the waif, Oliver Twist, Pip, adrift in the cold machinery of London. The Brontë sisters conjured Gothic isolation, Jane Eyre wandering the haunted halls of Thornfield. Flaubert's Madame Bovary ached with existential boredom. Dostoevsky's Underground Man revealed loneliness as spiritual sickness, corrosive and mad. For the first time, middle-class readers saw their own private ache reflected in print. Loneliness was now a literary subject, a shared wound. The diaspora of the dispossessed. Global capitalism scattered bodies across the earth. Irish famine migrants, Italian peasants, Eastern European Jews, African slaves and their descendants, all driven or dragged into foreign lands. From Ellis Island, letters poured back. Migrants longing for news, for home, overwhelmed by the alien coldness of American cities. Diaspora loneliness was now a global experience, no longer confined to the outcast, but imposed on entire classes and peoples. The silent rooms of women. Victorian women suffered their own cloistered ache, confined to the domestic sphere, denied education, trapped in marriages not of love. Many women descended into what was then called hysteria, but which we would now recognize as loneliness, despair, depression. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper stripped the veil from this condition. A woman's enforced isolation, her mind unraveling in the silence of her room. Here, loneliness was gendered, imposed by patriarchy, masked as madness. The public problem. By the century's end, loneliness was no longer merely private. Social reformers began to name it as a social crisis, the plight of the lonely city dweller, the aged poor in workhouses, the seamstress in her garret, the industrial orphan. Philanthropic societies sought to address it, but always as symptom, never as structural indictment. The new condition. By 1914, the transformation was complete. Solitude had been aestheticized for the elite. Alienation had been mass-produced for the worker. Urban loneliness had spread to all classes. Women's domestic isolation had entered public discourse. Migrant and diasporic loneliness had gone global. Literature and sociology alike named the wound. The word loneliness was now in full cultural circulation. Loneliness had become a condition of modern life, and the stage was set for its full explosion in the century to come.
Chapter 6. The Century of the Lonely Multitude. There are centuries when the human spirit shatters, and then must learn to inhabit its fragments. The 20th was such a century. The collapse came not all at once, but in waves. War, industry, migration, ideology, spectacle. And beneath it all, an unspoken transformation of the human habitat. The places and patterns through which we had once belonged were stripped, commodified, or obliterated. What had once been the fate of the few, the exile, the leper, the widow, became, by century's end, the condition of the many. Loneliness was no longer rare. It was mass-produced. War and the unmaking of belonging. The century opened with mass death. World War I devoured a generation of men. Village after village emptied. The ones who returned came back to a world that could no longer hold them. The poet Wilfred Owen, killed 1 week before the armistice, wrote of the trench not merely as slaughterhouse, but as a theater of isolation, a place where no civilian language could follow. The British lost generation spoke of this rupture, the impossibility of return. To survive was to be cut adrift from the net that had once defined life. World War II deepened the wound. Entire populations were displaced. Jews driven into exile, survivors of camps emerging with no world to return to. Children wandered alone through bombed cities. Millions crossed borders, voluntarily or by force, into a landscape of estrangement. The human habitat of belonging was in ruins. The lonely crowd. Mid-century brought a new architecture of disconnection. The city swelled. Kin networks frayed. The nuclear family, 2 parents, 2 children, 1 car, 4 walls, became the basic unit of American life. David Riesman's The Lonely Crowd diagnosed the shift. A society of other-directed individuals, publicly conformist, privately adrift. The new American was shaped not by tradition or conscience, but by the gaze of an anonymous crowd. Beneath the prosperity of the post-war boom, the psychic architecture of belonging had crumbled. Suburbia. Isolation by design. The suburb perfected the architecture of loneliness. The single-family home, the garage, the car, the television. Neighbors were no longer kin or covenant. They were spatially proximate strangers. Walkable commons disappeared. Public life was privatized. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique named it the problem that has no name. Middle-class housewives, materially comfortable, spiritually dying. The suburban home became a velvet cage. Loneliness was now domestic, respectable, ubiquitous. Loneliness as diagnosis. The century also marked the birth of loneliness as a medical and scientific category. Psychology began to study it not as sin or weakness, but as pathology. John Bowlby's attachment theory revealed the wound at its root. Early separation breeds a lifetime of relational hunger. Loneliness became quantifiable, subject to scales, metrics, risk factors. A private agony was now a public concern. Spectacle and surrogate connection. Mass media offered the illusion of connection and deepened the ache. Radio, film, television created shared cultural scripts, but they also created surrogate lives, vicarious belonging through the screen. 1950s. American housewives often lived entire days without real human contact. Television, their companion, their mirror. Media critics warned, mass culture breeds passivity, spectatorship, and a hollowed social life. The existential void. The intellectuals of the post-war world spoke of a deeper ache. Hannah Arendt warned that radical loneliness was the precondition for totalitarianism. An isolated individual, stripped of belonging, is easily captured by the false community of ideology. Existentialists, Camus, Sartre, wrote of the human alone in an indifferent universe. Not merely socially lonely, but cosmically abandoned. Beneath the age of prosperity, a metaphysical loneliness had taken root. Diaspora and displacement. The century of war and decolonization scattered peoples across the globe. Caribbean migrants in London, Indian migrants in Nairobi, Black Americans fleeing the South for the industrial North. Diasporic loneliness was a wound within a wound, not merely absence of kin, but presence of hostility. Racism, exclusion, the coldness of foreign streets. Letters from Caribbean migrants in 1960s London ache with homesickness, with the despair of being present and unseen. The loneliness of age. By century's end, another lonely class emerged, the elderly. Longer lifespans, fragmented families, institutionalization. Elderly women, widowed, lived alone in city apartments, sometimes unseen for days, weeks. Studies in the UK revealed epidemic rates of elder loneliness. Public campaigns arose, befriending the aged. But the wound was structural. Society had abandoned its elders, housed them, but no longer held them. A language of the lonely. By the final decades of the century, loneliness was no longer shameful. It was normalized, spoken in pop songs, films, self-help books. Eleanor Rigby, All the Lonely People. Taxi Driver, the isolated man, unseen in the city's glare. Loneliness had become the soundtrack of modern life. Not rare, not exceptional, expected. The new normal. By the end of the 20th century, war had shattered communal bonds. Urbanization had produced the lonely crowd. Suburbia had privatized isolation. Psychology had medicalized it. Mass media had aestheticized it. Diaspora had globalized it. Age had institutionalized it. And culture had normalized it. Loneliness was no longer a wound on the margins. It was the air in which modern life breathed.
Chapter 7. The Age of Hyper-Loneliness. We were promised connection. Instead, we were given the performance of connection, a mirror world of gestures, feeds, and spectral presence. And beneath this glowing lattice of screens, a deeper truth has emerged. Never have so many been in such constant contact, and never have so many felt so unseen. We have entered the age of hyper-loneliness. The machine of connection. It began, as such things often do, with hope. The early internet whispered of a new commons, universal knowledge, borderless conversation, a great weaving of the human family. Email gave way to instant messaging. Message boards gave way to social media. The smartphone placed this infinite network in the palm. Now, AI companions offer endless simulated presence. The promise, you will never be alone. But the machine was not built to bind. It was built to engage, to harvest attention, to monetize longing. And so, as billions connected, the ache deepened. The collapse of the real. At the same time, the scaffolding of embodied belonging eroded. Religious life, once the great net of ritual and presence, declined. Marriage rates fell. Birth rates collapsed. Kin networks thinned. Work became precarious. Neighborhood ties dissolved. Robert Putnam named it. We are bowling alone. The forms of communal life persist in name, but their substance has thinned to a simulacrum. We scroll together. We grieve alone. The theatre of the self. Social media did not connect the real self. It demanded a performed one. Curated profiles, aesthetic feeds, viral gestures, platforms engineered to extract comparison, envy, dopamine-driven compulsion. Young users report the paradox. The more they scroll, the more alone they feel. The perfect lives of others become a mirror of their own inadequacy. And beneath the spectacle, true friendship thins. 1,000 followers. No one to call at midnight. Gamified intimacy. Dating apps transformed even the most intimate search into a market. The body became a profile. Desire became a swipe. An illusion of abundance masks the new scarcity of trust and depth. Ghosting, casual disposability, the paradox of choice. Freedom, yes, but also a pervasive exhaustion, the sense of being consumed and discarded again and again. Work without weaving. The new economy offers flexibility, but at the price of community. Gig workers drive alone. Remote workers labor in isolation. The workplace, once a site of friendship, has become transactional and fragmented. Uber drivers spend their days in solitude. Coders stare into screens. Precarity breeds transience. Bonds dissolve before they can root. Work no longer weaves. It isolates. Simulated companions. And now, AI. Chatbots that soothe. Virtual idols that smile. Parasocial bonds with influencers who will never know your name. The line between human and machine presence blurs. Elderly people converse with chatbots in care homes. Young people form attachments to AI companions. Comfort, yes, but also a deepening dissonance. Relationships without reciprocity. Presence without embodiment. Are these bridges or further estrangements? The epidemic named. Today, the condition is no longer hidden. Loneliness is named as a public health crisis, a minister for loneliness appointed in the UK. Studies link chronic loneliness to heart disease, immune dysfunction, early death. Young adults, digital natives, report the highest loneliness rates of any age group. Elderly isolation remains acute. Workplace loneliness rises. Algorithmic polarization deepens emotional fragmentation. The age of hyperconnection has birthed hyperloneliness. The architecture of the ache. And at the heart of this paradox lies a design. Digital architectures do not serve human flourishing. They serve engagement. They amplify craving. They harvest attention by feeding the very loneliness they pretend to cure. A loneliness economy now thrives, selling fleeting salves to the wounds it deepens. We scroll, we swipe, we consume, we ache. The new condition. By the early 21st century, embodied community has collapsed. Work has fragmented. Intimacy is gamified. Presence is simulated. Loneliness is epidemic. The machine profits from the ache. We are more connected than ever, and more alone than any generation before us.
Chapter 8. The Economy of the Ache. There is an ancient rule, spoken or not. What the age cannot heal, it will monetize. And so we stand at a threshold both strange and grotesquely logical. A world in which loneliness, once a wound, once a grief, once a sin, is being transfigured into an economic sector. Not to be cured, but to be fed. From condition to market. Loneliness is no longer merely an emotion, nor merely a crisis of public health. It is now a line item in venture portfolios, a design principle, a market to be captured. Platforms, apps, devices, and services now exist whose core business model is not connection, but the simulation of connection, sold to a population stripped of the structures that once wove human life. It is the loneliness economy, and it is only beginning. The new architecture. The pattern is clear. The collapse of religious life is met with a market response of virtual communities, fandoms, and Discord servers. The collapse of marriage and kinship gives rise to dating apps, hookup markets, and parasocial relationships. The collapse of the public commons is answered by paid experiences, co-working subscriptions, and friendship apps. Aging and solitary living is addressed through robot companions, AI friends, and telehealth counseling. A fragmented work life is met with gamified workplace culture tools and virtual co-working solutions. The result: an economy whose profits depend on managing the ache, not mending it. Companionship for sale. Examples multiply: friendship apps, Rent a Friend, Bumble BFF, transactions disguised as friendship. AI companions, Replica, Character.ai, emotional intimacy as a subscription. Parasocial monetization, Twitch, YouTube, OnlyFans, loneliness rendered into tips, likes, and false affection. Robotic companionship, Japan's robot pets for elderly, robot nurses, emerging markets for robot partners. The pattern is not accidental. It is structural. Substitute presence in exchange for revenue. The aging crisis as frontier. Demographic collapse is accelerating. Fertility below replacement nearly everywhere. Populations aging alone. In Japan, robot companions are already deployed in elder care facilities. The state itself is underwriting the loneliness economy. AI-driven, emotionally intelligent bots are being prepared for Western markets, sold as companions for the elderly, but optimized for engagement metrics. The commodification of ritual. Even ritual and meaning are being sold. Mindfulness apps, artificial intelligence, spiritual advisors. Paid grief counseling, virtual tribes on Discord, identity-based communities on Substack and Patreon. Where organic community collapses, commodified belonging emerges, precarious, monetized, addictive. Romance as crisis market. Romantic loneliness is being mined. Dating app fatigue is widespread. Young people report higher romantic loneliness, distrust, sexual withdrawal. Into this void rush, AI lovers, paid romance coaches, girlfriend experience services, AI-generated sexual companions. The most intimate human need is being enclosed and sold. Hyperloneliness as business model. Here lies the dark genius of the system. Platforms are designed to sustain craving. The cycle, lonely. Seek digital connection, shallow interaction, increased loneliness. Repeat. True healing would collapse the business model. And so, the architecture of hyperloneliness is now self-reinforcing, profitable for capital, dangerous for souls. Forking paths. We stand at a civilizational fork. Path 1. Deepening commodification. Loneliness becomes a permanent market segment. AI companions outcompete human bonds. Connection is further enclosed and sold. Path 2. Counter movements of refusal. Embodied community, localism, slow friendship, spiritual renewal, new forms of belonging that resist the loneliness economy. Path 3. Hybrid futures. Complex mixtures of AI mediation and human presence. Ambiguous, unstable, morally fraught. The stakes. The question is no longer whether the loneliness economy will grow. It will. It is already entrenched. The question is whether we will build counterstructures, forms of life that cannot be captured by the machine. The future is open, but the moral stakes could not be higher. Will we live in a world that feeds on our ache, or one that restores belonging?
Conclusion. The refusal of the machine. It is easy to speak of decline as though it were fate. It is not. What was built can be unbuilt. What was designed to extract can be refused. What was normalized can be named. And naming is the first severance from the spell. Loneliness was not born with us. It is not the natural state of the human creature. It was constructed in hierarchies, in cities, in markets, in the architecture of the digital machine. The ache we now treat as private pathology is the symptom of a habitat stripped and captured. And now we stand at a threshold. The loneliness economy will grow. The machine will advance. AI companions will smile. Voices will whisper from devices. Simulacra of presence will multiply. And behind them, the ache will deepen, because this architecture profits from emptiness. The choice before us is not whether this system will expand. It will. The choice is whether we will bow to its logic or refuse it. Refusal will not be marketed. It will not be offered by app or algorithm. It will be made by the body in the real, in rooms where voices gather, in meals prepared by hand, in friendships that are not performances, in rituals that are not content. To restore belonging is not to yearn for a vanished past. It is to build forms of life that cannot be captured. Local, rooted, embodied, slow. There is no mass solution, no scalable fix, only the small and the real. But the small and the real are where human life begins again. And if we would remain human, not merely engaged, not merely connected, but held, we must choose this path. Refuse the machine, restore the net. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.